welcome back, ladies and gentlemen, to another episode of the Classical Antiquity Sidequest, a podcast covering topics from classical antiquity. The period of time is known for, as Edgar Allan Poe put it, the glory that was Greece, the grandeur that was Rome. Our next Sidequest will take us into a discussion about portrayals of antiquity in television and in movies, with a particular focus on what the proliferation of streaming services means for antiquity on the small screen. We'll discuss some recent shows that are set in ancient Rome and in ancient Greece, and we'll discuss how some shows have been subject to vicious attacks online by racist trolls. There's nothing to say other than it's just horrific and awful and shouldn't occur. Our guide for this next side quest is Dr. Monica Cyrino, a professor of classics at the University of New Mexico. Dr. Cyrino's research interests include the intersection of classics with popular culture in both film and television. She wrote a book called Big Screen Rome, edited and co-edited several books that cover antiquity and media, and presented and published on numerous films, including Gladiator, Troy, Alexander, and 300. In fact, she's also appeared on the History Channel show History vs. Hollywood, in addition to consulting on numerous film and TV projects, including one of my absolute favorite TV shows of all time, and you best believe we spend some time discussing that. Now, before we get started, I'd like to say thank you to Dr. Jennifer Garish for helping me get in touch with Dr. Cyrino. And by helping me, I mean making it happen. So thank you, Dr. Garish, for that. With that out of the way, let's get to the episode. Dr. Monica Cyrino, how are you?
I'm great this morning. How are you?
I'm doing fine. How is lovely Albuquerque?
It's great to be with you, Ben. It is very, very hot today. But very, very dry. As they say around here, it's a dry heat. So, you don't actually sweat or anything. So even if it's 100 degrees, I know that's different from other parts of the US, like the South or the Midwest, where there's a lot of humidity. So you can actually work outside in your garden and die from the heat without even knowing it.
And my brother, he and some friends took a trip to the Grand Canyon, and my brother was one of many people who ended up being airlifted out. This was after he graduated high school. So,
yeah. And people, I guess there's a lot of that going on this summer where people, just as the planet heats up and, a lot of people are traveling and trying to still do the kind of fun things they do in the summer. It's just going to shift the whole travel calendar because you can't go to the Grand Canyon or, for example, to the Athenian Acropolis or whatever when it's 115 degrees. It's just too dangerous. So there's been a lot of issues with tourists and travelers this summer not being prepared for the heat. So,
well, we benefited from it when we were in London. It was like 70, 80 degrees and no rain. So I'll take that small little gift.
Right.
The girls got to see Taylor Swift. I watched the most recent Bad Boys movie. It's a long story.
That's good.
Listen to Thucydides as I was waiting for him, as I was the dad at the concert. But
there you go.
Well, why don't we get into your background? People who come on for the first time, I like to give them a chance to tell us how they got into the classics and what they're doing today.
Well, that's a great question. Thanks for being interested. I grew up in Orange County, California, in a little town called Huntington Beach. And, went to public high school, was always interested in history and languages. And actually, oddly enough, I was very interested in English history and tutors and all that kind of stuff. I was one of those early adopters of Tudor mania. And I went to college, in fact, I wanted to study more Renaissance, stuff. I loved literature and Shakespeare and all that kind of stuff. But I also was, I've also really been and continue to be really a sports fan. So this was the 80s, so there weren't that many women sports reporters, but I wanted to be a journalism major and I wanted to be a sports reporter and go into locker rooms and stuff like that. So I went to UC Berkeley. All my friends went to UCLA, but I went to Berkeley. My parents were freaked out that I was going to become a liberal. Which is funny because they're so liberal now, but, this, like I said, this was a long time ago. And so I went to Berkeley as a journalism major, and I ended up in one of those, Western Civ classes that all freshmen, take. And first quarter, we were on the quarter system. First quarter was the ancient world. Second quarter was the Renaissance. Third quarter, I don't even remember what that was, but because by then I was, I was already hooked. The Enlightenment or something, or modern day, I don't even remember. But first quarter was the ancient Greeks and Romans. And there were these two, astonishingly great professors who just hooked me. I had never studied Greek, obviously not Greek in high school, but not Latin. My high school was a nice high school that, had Latin, had 4 years of Latin. I didn't take that. I took Spanish. So right at that moment I was hooked. So I became a classics major. I started Latin and Greek in college. And, from there, decided to go to graduate school. My professors at Berkeley said, if you want to be a professional classicist, you can't stay on the West Coast. You have to go back east and get your, your puppy papers, get your get your credentials at an Ivy League school. And I was, pretty freaked out because I'd never been, never been in the country, never been really east of Denver, I guess. And so I applied to Harvard, Princeton, and Yale offered me the most money. And like I said, sight unseen, I just showed up in New Haven.
It's a good plan though, because it ain't
Yeah,
cheap.
because it ain't cheap. So they paid for it, which was nice. I spent a couple of years crying every day because I didn't understand the East Coast and New Englanders in particular, right? Very, very different kind of context. But the connections I made there, obviously the education I got, the connections I made there continue to be very prominent and fruitful in my life today. Regularly hear from someone from my education, on a daily, if not weekly, basis, and have collaborators and contacts from those days that are just totally invaluable. And what a great education! I mean, I'm a child of immigrants, and I went to two of the best schools in the world, right? Certainly in the United States and maybe even in the world. So I'm really, blessed, hashtag blessed, as the kids say on Instagram, and really got a great education. So when I was looking for a job, I just wanted to go back west. Thank you, Ivy League, but I really, really wanted to be back west. And I got a job at the University of New Mexico, where I started in 1990. And I thought, I'll be here a couple of years. I've always liked the desert, and in this case, the high desert, the Rocky Mountain desert. It's a little bit different than Phoenix or whatever. But so I got here. I'll be here a couple of years, then I'll go back to California at some point. Well, 34 years later, I'm still here. The land of enchantment, as some people call it, the land of entrapment. But I do love working here, and it's been an interesting journey. So I've sort of negotiated my career from this wonderful place to live, and close enough to California that I can see my family quite often and visit. So that's how I got where I am.
And staying in Albuquerque was perfect because you got to work on what I think is probably one of the greatest television shows ever made, certainly recently. But Better Call Saul, you were a consultant for that TV show. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, sure. I don't want to make it sound more grand than it actually was, because it was just a little bit of kind of academic consulting. So,
No.
in New
Tell
Mexico,
you just
yeah,
completely just take it and run with it.
okay,
That old saying, when the legend becomes fact, print the legend. Just go with that.
right, right. Why let the truth get in the way of a good story, as we
Absolutely.
say sometimes? Yeah. So New Mexico offered a few years back, well before the pandemic, started offering, like some of the states in the South do, started offering generous tax incentives to TV and film production projects. And so, obviously Breaking Bad was one of the early adopters. Vince Gilligan and his crew came out to Albuquerque many years ago now to do Breaking Bad. That was such a success. that they did than the prequel, right? So Better Call Saul takes place in, I think it starts in around 2000, 2002. So a few years before before Saul Goodman meets Walter White. So anyway, so when the prequel was, or I don't know if you would call it that, it's a show in its own right, obviously, but in terms of the timeline, it's sort of a prequel to Breaking Bad. So the TV and film crews in New Mexico make quite good use of UNM, the University of New Mexico, for advisors, for any sort of information or input. And in fact, they utilize a lot of our students too. We have a pretty robust digital and film media program. And it's really infused a lot of, really great cash and experience, and it's really helped our state quite a bit. So anyway, like many of my colleagues, I get called fairly regularly by different productions to just help out with this or that. And being a classicist, we get called all the time to help on, this or that ancient language, right? So Vince Gilligan's, one of the production assistants, called me very early because this was for episode 1, season 1, right, which aired in 2015. So it must have been not too long before that. So in the fall of 2014, they reached out to me and said, we have some Latin that we want our character, Charles McGill, the older brother, and the sort of pretentious, attorney older brother of the main character, Saul Goodman, who at this time was still Jimmy McGill. We want him to say this line, which we think is a line from ancient Rome. And we want to make sure he's pronouncing it correctly. So we get this all the time. So in this case, I did not get to go on set or work directly with Michael McKean, the actor who played Charles Chuck McGill. I just put it on tape, put the recording on tape and sent it to them. And then they sent me the clip to make sure that it looked right. And also they wanted me to make sure everything was spelled right for the closed captioning. So that's kind of like a post-production thing you do when you advise on language matters. You do usually do a recording in advance. Sometimes they invite you to set to make sure that the actor is pronouncing it correctly, but not all the time. And then in post, you're often asked to make sure that things are correct for the closed captioning, which is of course very common in the way people consume television and film. They use closed captioning. I even do it now to make sure that I'm getting everything right. So anyway, if you're interested in the gory details, the line was a line from Cicero's De Finibus, which is an ethical discourse, and the phrase is become pretty fixed, you probably know it as an attorney, a pretty widely known phrase in legal circles. It's ergo a falsis principiis proficisci. That is, it's actually the infinitive. People translated it incorrectly, but it means something like, therefore, you are proceeding from false principles, from false beginnings, from, you need a better argument, right? So it's a way of sort of throwing shade on someone, to say, that's not going to fly. Your argument is built on quicksand. It will collapse. You need a better argument, right? So in the scene, which takes place in the very first episode, Jimmy goes to Chuck's house, which is it's nighttime. All the houses in this nice subdivision in Albuquerque, a nice little area with fairly nice homes. All the houses are lit up except for one house that's dark. And you recall, right, that Chuck McGill has this allergy to electricity, right, which forms a really big part of the show. So Jimmy comes to his house. The house is dark, lit with, we find that there's like a lantern inside, like non-electric lighting. And, Jimmy puts his cell phone, his key fob, and I think he takes off his watch too, right?
Yep.
Puts it in the mailbox, and we're like, what's going on here? Because this is the first episode. This becomes a ritual that we see in later episodes quite often. But this is the first time in episode 1, which is called Uno. Kind of cool. So Jimmy goes inside. He sees Chuck, hammering, typing away on a manual typewriter with a lamp sorry, not a lamp, like a lantern, like you take camping or whatever. And, they start to talk about Chuck's position at the evil, the evil law firm, HHM, right? Hamlin McGill, I think, is that correct, right? HHM.
Correct. Yep.
And, so Jimmy's like, look, you need to cash out. He had just met with the villain, the Hamlin character.
Who you think's the villain for a little bit.
Yeah. And then turns out, yeah. So, but he wants Chuck to cash out, but of course they want to keep Chuck on. They're like, oh no, he's going to beat this thing. And Chuck himself tells Jimmy in this conversation, this very intense conversation, this very long scene that's almost like a theatrical production, right? Just two amazing actors, talking to each other and expressing all this emotion. I really have a lot of respect for the acting profession, which is something that I could probably never do. But anyway, so, Jimmy says, you have to cash out, so forth, so forth. And Chuck is resistant to this. He says, no, I'm not going to do this, and at that point he enunciates the line, ergo a falsis principiis proficiesci, which he does in the classical pronunciation, which is pretty cool. So I'm glad that they, took my advice. There's many times where I've well, not many times, but a couple of times where I've done some Latin consulting for films, including vampire films. Not proud of it. But
hey, you got to pay the bills.
You got to pay the bills, right? And they use the what we call the ecclesiastical pronunciation. You've probably heard that, or any of your listeners who are, been to a Catholic mass, you know that they use the soft C, like in modern Italian, right? So instead of saying Cicero is how we would say it in Anglo, in English. In ancient Latin, we think they used a hard C, so it would have been Cicero, but then the Italians would say Cicero, right? So that soft C. So I use Cicero because there's two C's in there, right? So Cicero, Cicero in Italian, or ecclesiastical or medieval pronunciation. And a lot of times when you hear Latin spoken, especially in TV shows or movies that take place in the Middle Ages or the Renaissance, they will use that pronunciation, which is correct. But if you're trying to pronounce it in classical Latin, again, we don't have any recordings of classical Latin, but the paleolinguists are pretty sure that they used a hard C. So falsis principiis proficiesci. All right. So it was super cool to hear Michael McKean pronounce that correctly, the way that I had put it on a recording for him, and his people coached him to say it correctly. So it's pretty cool.
Yeah, and that fits for his character too. For those of you who may not have seen it, Chuck, or Charles, is a very precise, very proper. He seems like the kind of guy who would know that there's a difference between those stages of Latin and would make sure to get it correct, which is probably why he developed this allergy to electricity with the amount of stress that he put on himself. So that's an excellent choice that fits his character very well.
Yeah, absolutely. Our friend John Solomon in the classical reception field, a scholar in the classical reception field, and several others have worked a lot on this issue of why and how film and TV productions sprinkle in Latin and to a much lesser degree Greek, ancient Greek, into their productions. So Latin is used very often for vampires and other scary, characters, but it's very often used for attorneys as well, just like, as in your own work. So it highlights characters in very specific ways. You're exactly right that it highlights Chuck McGill's precision. I also think that it highlights and emphasizes his pretentiousness, right? It immediately sets the tone with his little brother Jimmy, that he's very disappointed in and he thinks is slightly beneath him, right? So when he says that line, Jimmy says right away, he goes, oh, that's the one about the false principles, right? Like, because Jimmy also, sort of codependent with his brother. He doesn't want to say that he knows exactly what it means, which he probably does because he's no dummy, but he defers to Chuck, right? He defers to Chuck and says, oh, you're giving me this Latin because you're the better, older, smarter brother. So it's a little poignant. It very much characterizes Chuck as snobby, pretentious, precise, and all these things. It's kind of cool in that scene. He's typing a letter, and he says to Jimmy, when he first comes in, and he says, "You need to take this letter and have it translated into Finnish." And Jimmy goes, "What? Are you kidding?" And then he says, I had forgotten this until I rewatched it in advance of our conversation. But he says to Jimmy, he says, "Yeah, just go to the language department at UNM. You'll find someone," which is cool because that's what they did. They came to me, in the language department. So the writer, Peter Gould, had sent his assistant to find me, and then he wrote that into the scene, which is kind of cool.
And one thing, and to kind of wrap up the Better Call Saul discussion, is I saw this comment online somewhere that said being an adult is realizing that Howard wasn't the bad guy you thought he was. So people who haven't watched that show, it's on Netflix, go watch it. But you mentioned some of the other projects you were involved in. Can you just give us a little bit of a rundown on what other TV, movies you've been involved with and consulted on?
Yeah, what's for sure. Thank you for asking. I mean, what's interesting is that people automatically assume, because I've done so much work, and written, and edited lots of books about TV shows and movies and stuff like that, that I worked on a lot of these projects, and I have worked on some of them, but only afterwards, like in terms of public relations or that kind of thing. I haven't done a lot of consulting. I'm starting to now, but I haven't done a lot of consulting on historical themed projects. But interestingly enough, I did get a lot of calls early on to work on language issues, sort of like what happened with the Better Call Saul. That was very brief and just, one episode. But I have done some work working on, I worked on the remake of the old vampire movie Fright Night with Colin Farrell, which was shot here in New Mexico. And that was very fun. I actually did write a little article about that and got in some trouble because of my NDA that I had signed. So we won't talk about that. But then I worked on a whole series that was here called The Messengers. It was for the CW network. And The Messengers was a sort of post-apocalyptic sort of teen fantasy drama. I mean, does the CW do any other kind of drama, right? That's pretty much their bread and butter, the post-apocalyptic supernatural teen drama. And that only lasted a season, but I really got I got a real education because I was on set a lot, and you and I have talked about this, how simply excruciatingly boring it can be to be sitting around in a trailer waiting hours sometimes to be called onto set to continue coaching, the actors that you're coaching. So this drama, The Messengers, involved a post-apocalyptic landscape, which of course New Mexico stood in for that quite well, as it does often. And what happened is this group of young people were infused with these various superpowers, right? So, one of them could be invisible, one of them could could run really fast or whatever. One of them automatically understood and could speak all of the languages of the ancient world. Wow, that would have been really useful to me in graduate school. So they call me in and they're like, Greek and Latin, do you do Hittite? Do you do Hebrew? And I'm like, no, actually, I don't do any of those. And they're like, great, so you'll come work for us. They didn't listen to me at all, So I just thought, this is going to be fun. This is going to be a great experience. If I need to translate some Babylonian or Hittite or ancient Hebrew or whatever, I know the people to call. So, I just did it. So I worked with them for, I don't know, several months, and it was a hugely influential and educational time for me to learn how the sausages are made. Like here I was writing about all this stuff. I had no idea, Ben. I mean, no idea how they do this. And how laborious, how many people are involved, right? In a production, it was crazy. The hierarchies of it, it was like the military, like it was like the military, but the military would even come in and be like, hey, you guys should take this hierarchy thing down a notch. I mean, it was so intense, So Anyway, so those are just a couple of things that I worked on recently. I do have a couple of projects in the works that I can't talk about that I'm working on as a historical consultant. They're super serious about their secrecy. And I have, like I said, I got in trouble once already a few years ago writing about something that I did, publishing an article about something that I did. And yeah, so they're super serious about that. But I'm working on a couple of things which will hopefully become TV shows at some point, long form series.
Well, let's talk a little bit about streaming platforms and what that opens up for telling stories about classical antiquity or taking mythology from classical antiquity and what that allows to happen. Can you talk a little bit about what we're starting to see with some frequency on these streaming platforms as far as revisiting time periods from antiquity?
Right. Well, what a good question, and it's really interesting to think about, how we think about these stories from antiquity, how we think about the receptions of these stories, because they get replayed in so many different formats, right? Our media menu is just so large and varied now that there's a lot of different ways that these things get replayed. And those of us, in the reception field, talk about reception threads or reception trajectories. So, for example, when you look at the Trojan War story, right, you can look at there's a couple of old movies, from Hollywood's Golden Age, the Helen of Troy movie or something. There's the famous feature film from 2004, Wolfgang Petersen's Troy, starring, of course, Brad Pitt as Achilles, Eric Bana as Hector, a 2-hour feature film, with a high budget with a lot of A-list stars that had to make certain choices in their presentation of the Trojan War, right, or the Iliad or whatever, right? So in a feature film like that, you'll get a lot of characters that are simply just elided, right, just thrown out. They don't have those characters. The Queen of Troy, Hecuba, the wife of King Priam, she's just not there, right? This happens a lot with female characters. You might have been able to guess that. They do a lot of composite characters, for example. So, they don't have as much time or money, and so they'll just, take a character like Briseis, the captive prize of Achilles, and they'll just layer her with a couple of others. So they threw in Cassandra, they threw in Chryseis, and they just made this composite character. And, classicists watching the film are like, what? It's hard to explain to your students. So then something comes along 20 years later, almost 20 years later, 15 years later, like the Netflix series Troy, Fall of a City, right? So even in the title, it shows that it seems like it's going to be just the Iliad, right? Or the end of the story of the fall of Troy does not happen in the Iliad. It happens in the time period after the Iliad. But even the title there suggests that it's going to be a very sort of fixed, point of time. But when you watch that series, and of course, I've written about it, we have a book about it. I really love this series. It's an 8-hour exploration of the Trojan story. So what they were able to do, the showrunner David Farr and the creative makers behind the show, what they were able to do was to really utilize a lot of the mythological material that we have surrounding the story of Troy, which is all over the ancient sources, as well as the material remains, right? We have a lot of vase paintings that pictorially represent elements of the myth at Troy. So they had a lot of stuff to work with, and in fact they did. So when you look at something like the Troy, Fall of a City series, we don't even get to the beaches of Troy until episode 4, right? In a multi-episode arc in 8 episodes. So David Farr and the makers utilize a lot of pre-Iliadic, pre-Homeric. Well, we don't know if it was pre-Homer. We imagine there was an oral tradition with some of these stories, but what we have in terms of written sources are sort of summaries of other epics that might have probably existed alongside the Iliad and the Odyssey, but we don't have them anymore. So, for example, the story of the Judgment of Paris, where the 3 goddesses vie for the golden apple of the most beautiful, which leads to Aphrodite bestowing Helen, sort of, allowing Paris to go and get Helen, even though she happened to be married. All that pre Trojan War material was told in an epic called the Scipio, which is now lost to us. But David Farr and the makers of Troy Fall in the City really used that material to flesh out the 4 episodes. They used a lot of dramatic material, right? In 5th century Athens, we had a blossoming of Greek tragedy. Everybody knows about Greek tragedy. And those Greek tragic poets used the myth of Troy quite a bit, extensively, in as material for their plays. So, he used a lot of that material, which told some of the stories before the Iliad and after the Iliad, and that was used in there too. With 8 hours, they even added some original subplots, right? Which is kind of refreshing. So when you're looking at a streaming platform, or even a where you can binge, like on Netflix or something, or even something like a limited series type of platform, or I'm trying to remember what the term is, what they use for something like Stars or Showtime, where they're still just dropping 1 episode a week, and then after the first run, like on Stars or Showtime, you can, or traditionally HBO, you can watch them afterwards. Yeah, I just blanked on the name of what those broadcast networks are called, because it's not really broadcast, but I'll remember it. But anyway, so even with those where you can't binge them all at once, you still have 8 or 10 episodes to draw out the story, explore some of the less less well-known aspects of a myth, or even a historical tradition, something like with some of the Roman Roman history series that are on TV right now.
And it seemed like, and we can talk about the reaction to Troy Fall of a City, because when I was getting ready for this, having watched it a couple of months ago, I saw the rankings of it on various online sites, and I just said, wait, I must have missed a memo here. I really enjoyed it and thought it was good. It seems like you can not only just tell a fuller story, but get more accurate of a portrayal of what we think life was like back then. And really, HBO Rome is probably the classic example of it, of this is as best we can tell what super upper class life would have been like for Romans. That in a movie, having watched Troy not too long ago, it was really rushed and compressed, and it was just kind of edit to get the story out. And so that's yet another advantage of these streaming platforms we have.
Right. Yeah. So, what's interesting, I mean, there's actually even this term, right? They call it Netflix bloat, right? Where some people think maybe they're adding too much, detail, right? Because there's such a huge demand now, a huge hunger really for new shows, new IP, new properties, or unfortunately a lot of remakes, prequels, sequels, and stuff. You take something that's successful, like Game of Thrones, so now you have House of the Dragon. Even the Spartacus series that we were talking about recently, they're going to have they're going to reboot that with a new show that they're in pre-production now, or in early days of production in New Zealand right now. We could talk about that a little bit. But so there was almost too much, right, on TV. Like, even when we're trying to, as consumers, to try to figure out what we want to watch, it can be a little overwhelming, right? That there is so much. But the format, you are correct that the format, if they choose the right thing, like, for example, if you were going to do something on the Medici family, in Florence, Italy, in the Renaissance or whatever. There's so much that can be done with that story, right? Because the family went on for a long time. There's a bunch of interesting stuff that utilizing the limited series format on a streaming platform with a commissioner like Netflix or Hulu, one of these very experienced, tried and true platforms, really lends itself to detailed and interesting creative decisions. Now, of course, you have to have good people working on it to make something interesting. There's a recent show on Peacock, which is an NBC affiliate, that just came out last month, called Those About to Die. which is the title of a book from 1958, a nonfiction book about gladiators, about Roman gladiators in the arena. It's kind of interesting that in the publicity for this show, they keep saying, they keep saying that's what it's based on, but it's not, obviously. So they just use the title and it's about gladiators. But in terms of the IP behind the show, it's an original show, right? Written by mostly by Robert Rodat, who wrote the movie Saving Private Ryan, and was nominated, I think, for an Oscar for that. So that one is not, it's not up to the quality standards of say an HBO Rome or even a Star Spartacus, in my opinion. But there's some good things about it, and it's definitely something. It's definitely something we have to engage with, because it is an important reception in a year when gladiators are back in fashion, right? So we do have to engage with it.
And I am, like we said yesterday, I will have seen Those About to Die by the time this airs, because my wife is now done with her master's program. So that's one that we want to watch. Uh, we'll save the embarrassment of me again stating that I just did not care for the movie Gladiator, even as Gladiator 2 comes out. Oh, my wife did say, just to allay some of your concerns and confusions about that, being a straight white male, I do like Braveheart, so that gets me a pass maybe for not liking Gladiator as much.
Yeah, I used to teach a course on, it was basically Monica's favorite movies. And I called it something else, but in my mind, it was Monica's favorite movies. And I'm a huge Braveheart fan, And I did Braveheart, I did Gladiator, a bunch of, just things that I like. And I called it something like, like Hero, like something like the film Hero or something. Braveheart and Gladiator share some similarities and actually I would throw in Mad Max. It's kind of interesting that we got Mel Gibson there, but they're man family revenge dramas, you know what I mean? And those tend to be slower than other kinds of revenge dramas. Um, you know, uh, you know, even Ben-Hur, right? The original 1959 Ben-Hur is a family revenge drama where Judah Ben-Hur is trying to find his mother and sister, right? That have been, imprisoned and tortured, eventually get leprosy. They end up, of course, they get saved at the end because it's a religious film and they got to get saved. That plot is a pretty common plot in movies, where it's, a family man, who remains rather sort of chaste, in the movie, in the sense of, he doesn't have a lot of, right, there's not a lot of sex scenes or whatever. Gladiator's a pretty unsexy movie, right? They get one kiss, so we'll see how they deal with that in Gladiator 2, if it's going to be, if it's going to end up following that relatively, I won't say boring, but it is definitely a stodgy sort of staid kind of plot line.
Well, and Ridley Scott movies there are a lot of examples where I think his pacing is just off, and not to get Reddit to come blow me up, but Blade Runner can be hard to watch if you don't just enjoy sci-fi. It's slow moving. I'm looking at some of his other movies. I really like Black Hawk Down, but Hannibal, even though I like Julianne Moore a lot, I married a redhead, obviously. So, Hannibal was not that great. Prometheus was kind of clunky. Alien Covenant, I don't know what was happening in that movie. I'm just saying, there's times where he hits it out of the park, like Alien, and then just from Thelma and Louise was also very good, but
and totally different from the rest of his corpus, right? So, one thing that I would do, if you were going to just do a deep dive into Sir Ridley, is to look at, on some of the more successful films. Did he have a different second unit director, for example? Who was his cinematographer? Especially second unit directors can really juice up the action quotient, you know what I mean? And that really helps a film in terms of that. In terms of Gladiator, you probably have read a little bit about it. It was a 3-act thing, essentially written by kind of like different people. There were a bunch of rewrites on the script, And the center act kind of, which was going to be a little bit more action oriented, got squashed so that they could put more action in the last act, right? So I wrote about this in one of my earlier, probably in maybe even in my first book, my first book about movies. But it had a troubled sort of script, history, which could account for the cloddish pacing in that film. So.
Well, we've talked
Well,
about some of the good things that streaming platforms can allow for, but let's go back a bit and talk about the negative things, which is the way a bunch of trolls responded to Troy Fall of a City and some other programs. Alexander, the Netflix documentary, mash up with kind of real life movies or TV
right,
show kind of arrangement, docudrama.
docudrama, yeah.
Talk to us a little bit about that. Educate us on that issue.
Yeah, it's interesting. We know the kind of world we live in, which is that, anybody who is a troll, can have access to a platform in terms of commenting online, in terms of posting on Twitter in the old days, now called X, of course. So there's just a lot of extra cinematic, extra televisual conversation going on constantly, right? So in the case of Troy Fall of a City, as you said, a number of people, when you bring it up, will say, wow, I heard that wasn't very good. Or, when I was trying to publish a book on it and I was shopping it to publishers, they're like, wow, how well did that do? How popular was it? How many subscribers did it draw to Netflix, et cetera, et cetera. And I was like, well, let me tell you. So what I understand, from what I understand in interviewing Derek Wax, executive producer of Troy Fall of a City, is that they kind of ended up in this sort of unfortunate temporal spot where they came in after Hamilton, but before shows like Bridgerton, for example. So in terms of their casting, where they wanted to get, as they said, we wanted to get the best actors for every one of the roles. So they cast a lot of Black British and Black South African. I don't think there were any African American actors in the show, maybe a couple of lesser characters, but they cast David Gyasi, a Black British actor, quite famous, a well-known actor, as Achilles in their series.
He was great.
And it was absolutely great. I mean, a brilliant actor. He gets all the, if you're a classicist or even just a fan of the Trojan War, if you've read your Homer, he embodies, that edge that Achilles has, that brooding quality, that perfection. I mean, he's obviously, beautiful. You have to be beautiful to be an actor. You have to have something that'll show on screen. His physicality, his intensity, his sort of, philosophical but kind of edgy nature and so forth. He was brilliant, and he has been in other things that he's been in. So the internet lost its marbles at this casting. And so even before the show premiered in 2018, they were review bombed by people who were upset about this casting. We'll talk about why they were upset in a minute. So you know what a review bomb is. You can go online and look up a restaurant or a product, and look at their reviews on Yelp or Amazon or whatever. And the same is true for shows and TV shows and movies, that you can look up reviews. And so this was an organized attack against the show. Maybe there were bots. I don't know if they had that sophisticated AI at that time, but they certainly had armies of people that just went on and said this show sucks, even before it premiered. So they suffered from I don't even know if you could call it a backlash, because it was a pre-backlash, right? Before the show even came out. So coming on the heels of Hamilton. Now, Hamilton had come out as a theatrical production. It was an immense success. People were like, "Oh my God, did you get tickets for Hamilton?" It was very hard to get tickets. It was expensive, and it was this big thing. Lin-Manuel Miranda was an overnight sensation, although there's no such thing as an overnight sensation. He got all these other gigs and so forth. But then, right about the time that Troy Fall of a City was going to come out, I don't know if you remember, Ben, there was a backlash against Hamilton. People started saying,
Yeah.
okay, this is interesting casting, using actors and performers of color to play all these white, these historically white characters like Alexander Hamilton and so forth. There was a backlash. People said, what about the actual, African Americans that were in America, in early America at the time? So there was this backlash against Hamilton. So when Troy Fall of a City came out with this concentrated and intentional review bombing, then it premiered in 2018, and like I said, the internet lost its mind. There was an intense and quite outrageous and appalling backlash from several racist backlash from several sources. One was from sort of garden variety, anti-blackness, right? There's just sort of, general anti-blackness, like, oh my God, this is awful. Achilles wasn't black. What would you say if we cast, this historical black person as a white person, blah, 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 that kind of thing. Then there was the even more sort of appalling kind of, I don't know, white supremacy, I guess you would call it. And there's, some serious, neo-Nazis online, white supremacists. You can't really wade too far into that because it's not good for your mental health, But several of our colleagues have written about it. Rebecca Futo Kennedy has a chapter about this in our Troy Fall of a City book, and she did, she put on a hazmat suit and went into those dark corners of the internet to do a very good analysis of what happened. And finally, there was a lot of interesting Greek nationalism, right, about saying that they were super invested in the character of Achilles, who we as classicists know is not a historical figure, right? I mean, it's not like Alexander. We have historical records on Alexander. Achilles was, pretty much, I can say, was probably not a historical figure, but is a character in an epic poem, right? And then, of course, in other literary productions. But the Greek nationalists, not all Greeks, obviously, but this very vocal group of Greek nationalists online were super invested in Achilles being white. Okay, now, did they get upset when Brad Pitt was cast as Achilles in 2004 for Peterson's film? Did they say, why didn't you find a Greek actor? Not so much, right? So when you look at Greek nationalism, I would probably suggest that it's going to be just a subset of the other two that I mentioned, white supremacy and just general anti-blackness. So there was this huge backlash against mostly about the casting of a Black Achilles. There was also some backlash about the casting of Hakeem Kazim, a British Nigerian actor, as Zeus. So they also had a Black Zeus, but it was a smaller portion, just quantitatively. People didn't. There weren't as many people upset about Black Zeus, but they were about that as well. I guess Zeus being a god, maybe they couldn't really fall back on the what gods are supposed to look like. But there, some people did. They said these are white gods for white people and that kind of thing. So there was an amazing amount of backlash to the show, which then, coupled with the review bombing, led to poor reviews. And one of the ambitions of my life right now is to you asked me, what am I working on now? I continue to work on sort of rehabilitating this series and trying to talk to the producers so that they'll do a sequel, an Odyssey or an Aeneid sequel. But anyway, just to wrap up that story, afterwards, I said that Troy Fall of a City came into this post-Hamilton, pre-Bridgerton world. And what I mean by that is that now you look at these series, even historical series, so something like Bridgerton set in Regency era England with real characters, that is some historical characters and then some, obviously fictional characters, but there's completely, race diversity casting, right? And nobody says hardly anything about it, right? So there's all these different characters. Every once in a while somebody said, well, Queen Charlotte, was a historical character, obviously, and was probably part Black or whatever. So you'll still get some extra televisual discourse about this, trying to justify it, and some people complaining about it. But you turn on any series now that's made on a streamer, on a commissioner, And there is mixed race casting. I was watching last night one of my new favorite series, the second season of Serpent Queen on Stars, about Catherine de Medici and her reign, as Queen of France and as a regent for her many sons who were king after her. She kind of controlled them. And, they have her brother, also named Lorenzo de Medici, not that Lorenzo, who's played by a British African actor. So, and her brother, her half brother, but still. So, not too many people comment about it now. You couldn't have a show now without race diversity casting. It wouldn't be picked up by a commissioner, which is what you call a streamer before it goes on TV. And because it's just part of the industry now. And as we know, Hollywood, or whatever you want to call the industry, I'll use Hollywood as a shorthand, is a copycat industry. They want what other producers want, right? Each streamer wants what that other streamer has. They have a historical drama, the other ones want a historical drama. If they have a superhero drama, the other ones want a superhero. If they have a woman-centered series, all the other ones want a woman-centered series. It's an industry that runs on what some scholars have called, on mimetic desire, right? Whatever seems to be successful over here on this streamer or this feature film, we're going to do that, right? Film scholars have for decades mentioned how Hollywood produces things in two, right? You get two biopics, two superhero, now it's way more than two because there's so much out there, right? There's batches. There's this batch of superheroes, this batch of Viking stuff, this batch of ancient Rome stuff, this batch of this or that or the other. So because of the just multiplicity, the amazing amount of stuff on TV and in the movies now, this mimetic desire sort of takes shape in batches rather than just in pairs like it used to, back when we were kids.
So what if people are listening to this and want to watch some more streaming antiquity themed projects? What else could they go watch that might do a good job or at least an entertaining job, right? Because this TV and movies are a commercial art form. There's art to it, but it's highly commercial and you want to make money. So at the very least, entertaining, maybe not accurate, but hopefully a mix of both. What else could the audience go watch?
That's a really good question. There's a lot of stuff out there. And if we're just looking at antiquity themed stuff, as I mentioned at the top of the conversation, I'm a big fan of Tudor history. And so I watch a lot of the Renaissance stuff and English stuff. Interesting, there's not a lot of medieval stuff. Our medievalist friends are really missing the boat on that. The slowly rowed boat. There's a lot of Viking stuff. I don't know if that counts as medieval. I guess I'm not a good enough scholar to tell you if that counts as medieval. There's a lot of Viking stuff, but not very much medieval stuff. There's a new show on Netflix based on Boccaccio's Decameron. It's kind of I saw them when they were shooting it at Cinecittà a couple years ago, the summer of 22. And I watched a few episodes. My husband didn't like it, and so I'll have to watch it when he's traveling. But it's pretty funny, but it's not as good as the antiquity themed stuff. So in terms of antiquity themed series that are on that you can access easily on streamers that people subscribe to on subscription television, the OG show is HBO's Rome, right? So I highly recommend going back to that. A lot of people are going back to that this year. There's, I've taught it every year since like 2000 and since it ended in 2008 or 9. I teach it to my students. The first season of HBO Rome is about as perfect a package of television as you will ever see. 12 episodes, perfectly paced, beautifully acted, sumptuous sets, exquisite production design, high degree of authenticity and accuracy. It's just about the best thing on ancient Rome that there is. It of course only lasted 2 seasons. The second season suffered from losing their funding during the shoot. So a show that had been mapped out on storyboards to last 4 or 5 seasons was compressed down into a problematic second season because it's so herky-jerky and the timeline jumps around and so forth, and is not as good. But even the second season is way better than a lot of stuff you see on TV now. As a legacy franchise, for HBO, it's unfortunate that they never, they talked about rebooting it. They talked about having a couple movies. That's another thing, feature films that sometimes follows a TV show like that. We saw that with Sex and the City or even Absolutely Fabulous. Some shows will have a feature film that follows the series, but it never happened. And then now it's just been too long. The actors, I think, some deceased, some, no longer interested in following up on HBO realm. But I could see them doing taking a young character, perhaps a fictional character, and building a new series around that character, utilizing some of the same people. So, and as you know, the money and a lot of the creative genius that went into HBO realm was then put into Game of Thrones, and that, of course, became such a huge, global phenomenon that I think HBO just kind of lost interest in doing anything else. So after that, I would probably recommend the show Spartacus on Stars. This is not for kids. It's not for children. This is a very
it is not.
This is a very edgy show. As you said, you were trying to watch it. And you can't. I can't even teach this show. So even though we did a book on Stars, Spartacus, it's not something that's easy to teach, even at a public university, because of the level of sex scenes and of the level of the CGI generated gore and violence
And it's
in this show.
Pretty explicit sex scenes too. Like the
Yeah.
extras, man, they're like, all right, I get to be on a show, and you're like, wait, I'm gonna do what?
Yeah, I won't go into the details of what we discovered about how they did some of those sex scenes in terms of the prosthetics and the wigs and so forth. Yeah, I mean, I was today years old, as the kids say, when I found out that you can wear a pubic hair wig for some of those scenes, but we won't go into that. But in terms of its success, Ben, it cannot be overstated how successful that franchise was in 4 seasons, three long seasons and one sort of truncated prequel season that they did in 2010, 2011, 2012, and 2013. I mean, in rapid succession. Again, high production values, expensive, but not as expensive because it was shot in New Zealand, utilizing New Zealand crews and a lot of extras, and utilizing a lot of New Zealand talent. They made names and made the careers out of a lot of New Zealand and Australian actors, which is a really great thing that they did. And you cannot overstate the success in terms of driving subscribers to Stars. And Stars looks at Spartacus as what they call a legacy franchise, like their show Outlander, in terms of its ability to generate new IP. So, for example, not even example, I'm here to tell you that Stephen Estenite, the showrunner for Stars Spartacus, got together with the Stars folks, and they are going to make Spartacus House of Asher. They are making it right now in New Zealand. We don't have a premiere date, probably next year sometime, probably late next year. And this involves a character called Asher, who was one of the gladiators in the House of Batiatus, who died in the Mount Vesuvius scene in the last episode of the last season in 2013 of Spartacus, and he died. But because he was, a non-historical character, sometimes they even bring back historical characters, they are going to tell a story what happens if Asher did not die, and in fact was awarded this gladiatorial school as a reward for his stance against the Spartacus rebellion. And so what we understand of the story that's been published so far is that Asher, this ex-gladiator who's, not a gladiator anymore, but he is going to now be the CEO of this new gladiator school. And the rumors that Lucretia is back, Lucy Lawless, Xena herself, who played Lucretia and also died, or at least we saw her fall over a cliff. So it's one of those things where you fall over a cliff and you don't show the dead body. So somehow she's going to come back. We don't know about any of the other characters from the original Spartacus series. They have named a lot of new characters that's going to be in this show. And I'm sure that it is going to have the same level of sex and gore that Spartacus was famous for. And as you know, Starz has actually debuted this summer a new slogan for their channel, and it is, "We are all adults here." So this is their wheelhouse. They are going to carve out for them, in this extremely crowded streamer environment that we live in now, with Hulu and Amazon and Peacock and Paramount and all of these streamers, and HBO and Showtime and the OG ones. Starz has said, "We are all adults here." So they're going to have a new Spartacus. They're going to have the last season of Outlander with a prequel, series, Blood of My Blood. They're going to do a prequel series to that. So that's, again, the mimetic desire that these production companies work on, that these streamers work on. They're going to keep copying each other, and to some extent copying themselves, right? With these remakes and reboots, and what's the word they use? Reimagining, right? Reimagining Spartacus on screen. So yeah. Okay. So Spartacus is one that I would recommend, again, for the adults in the room.
Yes.
Sky TV, together with MGM Plus, which is an American company. Sky's a British and European company. Got together with MGM Plus, which used to be called Epix, now is rebranded as MGM Plus, and did 2 seasons of a show called Domina, which is also very good, and is on you can get it on MGM. Americans can get it on MGM Plus, which you can add on to your, I think you can add on to your, now I can't remember if it's your Hulu or your Amazon, a la carte. And this is a woman-centered show focused on Livia Drusilla, the wife of Augustus, the first emperor, the first ruler in the Principate of Rome. And I really like this show, and I really want to do my next book on this show. I'm finding kind of a little bit of a hard time trying to get people interested in working on it with me, and also finding a publisher, just because it was not as well, it was well received, but it just wasn't watched by that many people, because of the, it's not on a very popular streamer. It's not one that, people get in their bundles very often. And so that was a little bit hard to find. There's also a show called Barbarians on Netflix, which is about, it's also a Roman-themed show, which is a German-made show, so you have to follow the subtitles. It's all in German and Latin. So to get back to our earlier conversation at the top of the hour, if you're a Latin aficionado or Latin geek, there is so much Latin in this show. I really would like to do a little bit more study on it to find out who worked on it, but it's all subtitles, so you have to wear your glasses or sit real close to the TV or use your laptop or whatever. But it's absolutely brilliant if you are a Roman army fan, because it focuses on the Roman military in Germania, and the battle of the Teutoburg Forest, which of course was a cataclysmic loss for the Roman legions, and how the Germanic tribes reacted to that. I would say there's a little bit of German nationalism, which I guess is kind of a tricky subject at any time. A very little bit injected into that series. It's very pro-German and not so good on the Romans. Following the historical character of Arminius, a German tribe member who was raised by Romans to be a Roman military leader, and his sort of conflicting loyalties. A really brilliant show. There's a couple of other ones I wouldn't recommend. Some people like Britannia. Has too much of a fantasy element, too many druids for my taste.
It's kind of weird.
Yeah, did you watch that one?
I tried and I got bored and stopped.
Yeah, Ben, I got to tell you, I have very low standards. My friends tease me all the time that I'll watch anything, and I could not get through that. I even tried to have a glass of wine, loosen up my brain so that I could get into the fantasy elements, and did not work for me. So I didn't like that one very much at all. What else? And then, like I said, recently, just last July, last month, a couple of months ago, they Peacock premiered Those About to Die, which apparently has been doing a pretty good audience. Those About to Die comes at a time when, did you follow that internet little fluffle? I don't even know if that's a technical term, but there was a little interesting internet thing that happened at the beginning of the year where women were supposed to ask their boyfriends and husbands how often they think about the Roman Empire. And apparently it turns out every day, right? Every day. And then this generated a lot of memes and a lot of Instagram posts and a lot of stuff all over,
A great
all over
skit on
the,
Saturday Night
a
Live.
great skit on Saturday Night Live, right? It was awesome. And so I do think that Those About to Die was in production well before this came out, but they certainly capitalized on it. And the show is written by Robert Rodat, who has written a war film, Saving Private Ryan. It has as one of its directors, a couple of the early episodes, a couple of the last episodes are directed by Roland Emmerich, a famous German director who directed a lot of action films, including Independence Day. I think I said the wrong film when we were discussing this earlier, but it was Independence Day. So really good action, director. So the action in the series is very good. The characters are pretty poorly drawn. There's too many characters, like in Game of Thrones, and they throw them at you all at once in the first episode. Like literally, I'm not kidding. Like 30 characters in the very first episode, and a lot of people turned it off after that. But some people persisted, and there are a few good things about the show. The action is very good. The production values are very high. They spent a lot of money, $150 million by some accounts on these 10 episodes. And so it's good, it's fun to watch, and like visually it's pleasing. The CGI is really cool when you can see it centers on the moment in the reign of Vespasian. It starts with Vespasian and goes through his two sons, Titus and Domitian. It ends with Domitian. I think there's going to be a second season. And so it focuses on the moment when the Colosseum was being built. That's pretty cool. And the CGI showing the half-built Colosseum is really cool. I'd love to show that some of those sequences to my students, because it really shows like how long it took to build something, what it must have been like in the city of Rome with this dust constantly all the time and people working on it. We all know what it's like to have a construction project in your town, right? Like them redoing, the state redoing the roads or something like that. So the dust coming and everything. And it focuses on this, really original sort of idea of the moment where chariot racing, which had been the predominant form of sports entertainment in ancient Rome, in this period in the first century AD, and the races in the Circus Maximus, right? The Circus Maximus is still there today. I mean, the area where the Circus Maximus is a park. People jog around it. You can go to it. There's restaurants around it and so forth. So the moment in history when the transition from the predominance of chariot racing as the premier sports entertainment in Rome transitioned to gladiatorial entertainment. And we all think, well, gladiators, Rome, that's just it. It's just gladiators. No, they had chariot racing, and it was a very elite, sort of like, Formula One in Europe, right? Very elite, very much supported by the aristocrats of Rome. They made a lot of money in sports betting and so forth. And the show focuses on that transition from chariot racing to gladiatorial combat, gladiatorial entertainment in the Colosseum, which it shows the dedication of the Colosseum in the last couple of episodes, which Emmerich directed. So that's super cool, especially for those of us who are sports fans. It's super cool. It's very original. But gosh, getting from point A to point B, getting from chariot racing to gladiatorial entertainment, the characters are I'll be generous and say cartoonishly drawn. Maybe they'll be a little bit better in the second season. You know, but anyway, so there's several historical characters, a lot of historical characters, and then a bunch of original subplots. So we have a whole family from North Africa, which includes a very probably the best character and my favorite character, a woman named Kala, who is this fiercely protective mother. She comes with her three children who need to be protected. One of they've been enslaved. She saves a couple of them. One of them becomes a gladiator. One is a house slave. And she, her intelligence and her wit help her to protect her children. So that's an original subplot. There's also three brothers from Hispania, right, from Spain, that show up with these great horses. Spain was the place where the best horses came from. They show up with some Andalusian horses. This can be historically supported, and these three brothers end up in an extremely poorly written set of subplots, but they are characters that we really like, and I won't spoil it for people, but let's just say the body count in Those About to Die is much more even than Game of Thrones. I think I did a little unscientific count, and it was something like an average of 25 per episode. It's pretty high. And then, when they're killing off characters you care about, it becomes, a little hard to make that sort of parasocial identification that, film scholars tell us is necessary to get invested in a show, right? When your favorite character, is a corpse by the end of, episode 4, that becomes problematic for you tuning in next week. So that happened a lot on Game of Thrones, and people talked about that a lot. But it's worth watching in terms of what is sort of the summer of the Gladiator, in terms of, we're going to get another Gladiator movie from Ridley Scott by the end of November, I think. So it seems like Those About to Die was sort of trying to capitalize on that. Not only that internet, that internet kerfluffle that I talked about a little bit before about how often do you think about the Roman Empire, but also to sort of really preempt because it's a different genre, but to sort of get in on the tidal wave that's going to end up with, or at least peak with, Gladiator 2, a very expensive Ridley Scott film coming out in November with a whole bunch of A-list talent, right? Pedro Pascal, Denzel Washington. I mean, some serious A-list talent in the film, and Ridley Scott himself, a big A-lister. So those are some things I would recommend right now in terms of Roman themed stuff. I do highly recommend people check out Troy Fall of a City. We talked about that a little bit, so I hope that goes without saying, but I'll say it, that I think this is very worthwhile. And just speaking to my classics, classics teachers, classics professors, and high school teachers, it's pretty demure, the series in terms of the sex and the gore. I think you can show it. There's certain scenes that I think are so worthwhile that you could show in a Greek mythology or a Homer and Hollywood type class. The Judgment of Paris scene is just spectacular, so well done. Right at the beginning of episode 1, you can find it easily online, or just log into your Netflix account. Unfortunately, there is not a region 1 DVD of it. Not that anyone uses DVDs anymore. We all just log into our Netflix and show things from that. But I highly recommend that for casual watching, and also for teaching, for those of you who are listening, out there who are teachers of mythology.
And we haven't even mentioned I, Claudius, which very different production value, but that's like, where are my Eagles, or give me back my Eagles. I always get the line wrong, but you mentioned Domina, and that made me think of the portrayal that we got of Livia by the BBC. That was amazing.
Yeah, it was amazing. I mean, that's so old school that, to me, that's like teaching silent movies or something. I mean, I suppose I have a bit of a bias to the more contemporary productions, and you were probably right, Ben, that one of the reasons I'm having a little bit of trouble getting people interested in Domina to work on it with me is that everybody keeps saying, oh, well, we have to look at I, Claudius, and we have to look at the portrayal of Livia there, and how the new show, somewhat to a great extent, rehabilitates her from that portrayal. And so I need to wrap my head around, being able to look at that reception thread. So, thank you for mentioning that reception thread. Because I'm just not a fan of the older series. Talk about pacing. I find it interesting that you like I, Claudius and not some other things that have slow pacing, but because that's about as
It
snail's pace as you can get.
it started really slow. It took me about 2.5 episodes to get into it. It was hard to start with, but I thought once it got to stay on the Ridley Scott theme, the guy who was in Alien who gets the face hugger and brings the
Yeah.
alien back on board. Uh, Once he becomes emperor, it really has a different whole pace to it and really gets going.
Right. So I understand that. I think if you're interested in the old miniseries, I mean, a lot of people rewatched the original Shogun this summer because of the new Shogun, right? That was on FX this summer, which was probably I know this is not on our topic, but it is a historically themed TV series. The Shogun that was on this summer was probably the best thing I've ever seen ever, hands down, the best historical television drama that I have ever seen. And that includes HBO Realm, and that includes any other series that I've ever written about. And I only wish I had the scholarly expertise to write about it, because I think it was hands down the best thing I've ever seen. I don't even know how else to I'm sort of speechless about it. And I know people who know me would say, "You speechless?" I mean, just from the production values, the acting, everyone should tune in for the Emmys this fall, because it's going to sweep everything. It's just going to be the new Game of Thrones or whatever. It was absolutely spectacular on all levels.
That is something though that I do want to watch again. Wife finished with master's program. That is on the list. And before we leave this topic, you mentioned Spartacus and the pubic wigs. Just so everybody knows, that is called a merkin.
It is called a merkin, and the women wear them all the time. The men wear them sometimes. And do you want a little bit of a scandalous story, or are we trying to keep this?
You know what? I mean, go right ahead because like I watched this interview of Matthew McConaughey with Stephen Colbert where Matthew McConaughey used the term merkin to refer to a friend, and they would call each other that back and forth, and neither of them knew what that term meant.
Oh,
And
that's funny.
and a hairdresser was like, no, no, well, you don't really get what you're saying.
Yeah, you don't get what you're saying. Well, what was interesting, and I'm working on some Spartacus stuff now for another talk that I'm doing. People can continue to be fascinated by the Spartacus reception thread, and whenever we talk about reception threads, Spartacus is one of the best things to talk about because there's so many different Spartacuses all over the place. But there's a story from the Spartacus Blood and Sand. There's Spartacus Blood and Sand, Spartacus War of the Damned, Spartacus Vengeance. Wait, what order? Let me do it right. Spartacus Blood and Sand, Spartacus Gods of the Arena, Spartacus Vengeance, and then Spartacus War of the Damned. Okay, those were the four in order. So there's a story from season one where one of the gladiators wears a prosthetic penis, and the in an echo or an homage of the original Spartacus movie, Stanley Kubrick's movie from 1960. There's a scene in that film where these pampered Roman matrons, these elite Roman women, these very they're portrayed as being very sort of snobby and carefree and so forth. They choose gladiators by how beautiful they are to fight to the death in the arena, right? So Spartacus, the TV series, did a sort of homage to that scene to have these pampered Roman ladies. They're always pampered. The elite aristocratic Roman ladies who have not a care in the world except their own personal pleasure. Spartacus, the TV series, did an homage to the earlier scene where the Roman elite women choose gladiators based on their beauty. This time, though, it was not only their beauty, but it was the size of their penises. So the sergeant, the gladiator sergeant tells all the gladiators who are slaves, right? So they have to obey, to take off their loincloths, right? So that the Roman elite women can look at their size and choose based on how beautiful they are. And this, of course, was for a sex show, so it's kind of different. Spartacus, the series, ramped up everything and took it to its kind of obnoxious and rather obscene, extreme degree. So one of the guys who was supposed to have the biggest one that gets chosen, the biggest penis, he apparently felt that he didn't want to have his own penis on camera, or perhaps it didn't live up to the script demands, and so he wore a prosthetic that everybody, and here comes the funny part. Thank you for listening to my TED Talk. Here comes the funny part. It was nicknamed the Kirk Douglas by the prop master and the actors on set, in homage to the star of the original Spartacus movie, the great Kirk Douglas. So I don't know if this has gone on to be something that is used in other shows, but I kind of think that after that Spartacus series, there's been a little bit of a mitigation of some of the high degree of sexuality that's shown in that series. Maybe the Stars continuation series will be also very sexual. I tend to think it will be, but other series are not as explicit as that series was. So anyway, that's kind of a funny little story that I think is fun to tell in certain in certain audiences.
That is fantastic. That is fantastic. And because this is an audio medium, nobody except our guest got to see how I was stopping myself from laughing out loud as she was recounting the whole story. That was great. Well, you've given us a lot of TV assignments. We've discussed movies we can watch. Could you give us a good book from the Antiquity time period to read?
You mean an actual ancient source, or people who are talking about these movies and
Anything.
TV series?
It just needs to touch on Antiquity.
Yeah, Monica's reading list. Well, there's a bunch of interesting stuff. If you go on Amazon, you could actually even look at my author page, and I've listed a whole bunch of things there that, obviously some of the books that I've written or edited are on there, but I also have a couple of other recommendations on there. It's a really big thing right now. There's quite a blossoming of mythological retellings right now, written by very talented novelists, in the voice of various mythological characters, like Madeline Miller, is one of those authors, and so forth. If people who are interested in novels, mythological retellings, especially from the point of view of women, female mythological characters. I personally don't read a lot of those just because I don't really have time, and when I do have time, I watch I consume visual things like TV and films, and not so much. I'm not so much of a book person. Isn't that terrible for me to say as a classics professor? I think it's great to go back and read your Iliad and Odyssey. I mean, there's never a wrong time to pick up Homer. Of course, they're for very different types of readers. The Odyssey moves much more quickly. There's a lot of action, a lot of a lot of time jumps and so forth. It's like it's like an Oliver Stone movie. But the Odyssey is for those that like their action a little bit more jumpy. The Iliad, of course, plods along with a lot more sort of heavy close-ups to lots of different ways that people can die. If you want a little combo of that, you can reread your Aeneid. I'm teaching the Aeneid this semester, and Virgil's Aeneid is probably the most important literary document in the Western tradition. I think I could say that without blushing. And it's going to be fun to teach, actually. So was reading that yesterday. Well, that's how I'll spend the rest of my day today, which is a great thing for the weekend.
And for those of you who haven't yet, go back and listen to our episode on the role of trauma in the Aeneid with Dr. Helen Lovett, which was fantastic, I think. And also we ended up talking about movies and television too. So it was a perfect synergy of things there. Now, one other matter, well, two technically, but the first one, what would be a good future episode topic? Not promising it will happen, but I will at least try.
Well, I'm sure you're gonna want to get someone to talk about the new Gladiator movie because it's gonna, for good or for ill, it's gonna make a big splash. And those of us who work in the field want it, to do well, obviously, because that generates, more conversations for us and more, more opportunities for analysis. But it would be interesting, to be able to go back and look at this mini renaissance, and we're coming up on the 25th anniversary of the original Gladiator film. Can you imagine? It's crazy. I took my students to see that film, like as a field trip. So, and it was also on my birthday. The premiere of that movie was May 5th, 2000. And so, and remember the posters? It said 2000 AD, which I thought was just, it was just the artist thought that that would look cool. But of course, that was a little visual thing that told people that this was a movie, right? That had historical, resonance, and it had, a type of authenticity that was going to please audiences. So that's kind of cool too. So that would be something to take a look at. The new how does stars as a streamer, as a production company, as a commissioner, how do they deal with perhaps some of the changing tastes, of audiences to have maybe less sex and gore and violence in their properties. We'll see how that works with their new season of Spartacus, right? You can see in Outlander they've completely, made that a much more demure, right, to use the internet word of the month, a much more demure series than it was when it started out. So stars, we're all adults here, but those adults are becoming a little bit more judicious in what they want to see in terms of sex and violence. So that might be an interesting topic for a future discussion.
Okay, I'll tell you what, I'll rewatch Gladiator, watch Gladiator 2, and then all of those about to die, and then I'll reach back out to you and we can retrospective those projects because you made me feel really old when you said it's 25
Yeah.
years since
Well,
Gladiator.
and lucky for you, the original Gladiator movie is on TV like all the time, like on like a whole bunch of different channels, right? And the NFL is starting up again. The NFL still uses the couple of the channels now. The NFL is all over the place. A couple of the legacy NFL channels like Fox and NBC and CBS still use the soundtrack, the theme music from Gladiator in their NFL productions. So there's this real crossover of arena entertainment between the old Gladiator, the OG Gladiator, and what we still consume in terms of sports television. It's fascinating to me as a fan of both. So,
Well, hopefully you root for a team that's better than my horrific Carolina Panthers, which got pilfered. Actually, I don't know if you could say they got pilfered. They willingly let themselves get robbed by the
yeah,
Bears.
yeah,
And
yeah.
I was at a Halloween. We were hanging out at some friend's house last Halloween, and he's a Bears fan, and his kid was wearing a Bears jersey and a backpack. And I said, "Hey Matt, is that backpack for all the picks you stole from the Panthers?" And he was like, "That's a good one." And I said, "Yeah, that's I
Yeah.
I
Who's
ugh,
even the quarterback this year? Did they get a pick? Did they get one of those quarterbacks in the draft?
it's Bryce Young, the kid from
Oh,
Alabama. That
right.
we got him last year, and we didn't have a line, and we had a coach who tried to run a system that wasn't suited to him, and then
You have a new
it's a whole
coach too?
thing. Yeah. So all right. So I just recently rewatched Fight Club for the first time in a while, and I love that movie.
It is
Fincher,
good.
David Fincher did a really good job
Yeah, it's a great film.
construct. If you like just film as an art form, that's a good one to watch.
Right.
And now I'm convinced after watching it again that David Tepper, the owner of the Panthers, is doing his own personal Project Mayhem with the Carolina Panthers.
Huh, interesting.
That's the only way it could make sense, because why would you hire and fire that many coaches? Why would you invest all the money and have this whole, we're paying close to like, I don't know, was it like $1 billion or something for all these consultants? And then in a year, you're like, nope, you're done. We're getting rid of them. And to stay off topic here, why would you let all these quarterbacks leave and then go somewhere and be good, a la
Right.
Baker Mayfield?
Right. Yeah, Baker played for us for a little while. I'm a Rams fan, so we're happy to have a great owner, a great GM, an absolutely astonishing, genius coach, after so many years of just, and then they were gone, right? Like, I mean, because I'm old, I was a Rams fan growing up, and then they left, and and so now that they're back, and it's just been great. I'm so happy to be a Rams fan now. So anyway, okay. We're going to edit all that out.
All right. No, it's
But
fine. It's a side quest is in the title, so it's totally fine. It's totally
if you
fine.
do follow me on social media, you'll see that most of my pictures are of me at sports events. So
There you go. And where can we find you on social media, by the way? That was another thing I meant to ask.
yeah, if so most of the time now I'm on Instagram. I don't do I was on Twitter for like 5 minutes, 20 years ago or whenever it first started, and it's just so awful, and I was an early escapee, so I'm proud to say that. So you can mostly find me on Instagram, Big Screen Rome, at Big Screen Rome, and I'm also on Facebook. For those of the older generation in the crowd. If you want to follow me on Facebook, I mostly put articles there actually about the industry. So I post a lot of stuff about, oh, here's a new series that's coming. So I kind of use that as my, up and coming, uh, uh, announcements of things that I've heard about that people should pay attention to. And Instagram is, of course, mostly just pictures of pretty things. So those are my two places you can follow me, but people can email me anytime. If they have questions or want to talk about, anything about classical reception. What we call the official title of the business is classical reception. But business is booming right now, so we're happy about that. That there's a lot of stuff out there being produced and reproduced and reproduced. So we're happy about that.
Well, Dr. Cyrino, thank you so much for coming on. I really enjoyed this episode. It was extremely informative, and I look forward to our next collaboration about gladiators. And that will require me to rewatch and perhaps reappreciate or develop a different appreciation for Gladiator. We'll see. Now, folks, you know where to find us, bullcitycoordinators.com. Check us out on the socials at Duke FB Coverage on Twitter. You can find us at Antiquity Pod. We are, I think, pretty much everywhere you get your podcast. Check out our YouTube channel. That's where we're focusing most of our efforts here at the moment. And guys, hey, give us a call, 540-632-0160. Leave a message, ask a question. You'll get on the podcast. I'll do my best to answer it and consult with the people that I know who are experts in this field to get a good answer for you. Please call in. And remember, folks, the Classical Antiquity Sidequest is a podcast without end.